And I did love this change in the movie. However, if you think about it, it doesn't make sense because the movie... Hello, and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The book is by Jack Finney, and it was originally published serialized in a magazine in 1954, and then it was published as a full novel in 1955. And then the first movie adaptation is from 1956 and was directed by Don Siegel, and I will also be talking about the 1978 adaptation directed by Philip Kaufman. And there have been two other adaptations, Body Snatchers from '93, I believe, and then The Invasion, which stars Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig. However, I have not seen either one of those yet, but if you have and you think they're worth watching, definitely comment down below. But this is, of course, the story about a man who realizes that the people in his town are being replaced by alien replicas. And the 1956 movie is very similar to the book, and the '78 movie even, like on the surface, it might seem like there's a lot of changes, but even the '78 movie has a lot of the same plot beats as we had in the book and the '56 movie. However, it's interesting because all three of them have different endings. And before I get into the book versus movie episode, I want to acknowledge that I am not filming in my usual location. We are out of town right now, but because I'm a dedicated YouTuber, I still wanted to get this video filmed. And honestly, like, the place we're staying in isn't great for filming, and I didn't want to film around people. And so filming up here seemed like the best option, and also we get a cool view too, so it's kind of a win-win. But yeah, to get back to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I am just going to jump right into the plot, which means we will have spoilers going forward. And I'm going to begin with the book plot, just so we can have that as a foundation going forward as I get into the two movies. And so if you have already read the book and you don't need to hear the plot overview, then go ahead and use the timestamps down below to skip to the next part of this video. But in the book, we have Miles, who is a doctor who returns to his hometown, and in his hometown he reconnects with this high school sweetheart of sorts who is named Becky. And through the course of the story, he and Becky have multiple friends and family who come to them claiming that a loved one has been replaced by an imposter. And those on the outside, and even some of the family members, don't see it and they think the person is normal. However, certain members are like, no, like something's missing, they're lacking something, they are not the same person. And so they are adamant that this person is an imposter, even though from the outside the person is exactly the same. And because Miles is a doctor, a lot of these people come to him directly with these complaints, and he then refers them to a psychiatrist. However, in the book, the story takes place over the course of weeks, and people who will come to him one week saying a loved one is an imposter, like the following week or two, they then return to him and they're like, oh, I don't know what was wrong with me. Like, it's totally fine. Like, I was just being crazy. And so it's suspicious that all of these people say a loved one is an imposter, but then it's also suspicious that within a week, they all claim that it's all fine now. But early on in the story, Miles has a friend named Jack, and Jack has a wife named Theodora, and the two of them show Miles and Becky a body that they had found in the basement, and it is the body of a man, and his height and weight are very similar to Jack's. However, the look of the body is just very unblemished, and it has no discerning features, and it just looks like a blank slate of a body, and it has no fingerprints. And so they are very confused and think that this is very strange. And then later in the night, Jack is asleep and Theodora goes to check on the body, and the body is starting to change to resemble Jack. And so she freaks out, she wakes Jack up, they go to Miles's house, and then Miles, he goes to Becky's house where she is asleep, and in her basement he finds a replica of her. And so he goes, takes the real Becky, wakes her up and brings her home. And so the four of them are at Miles's house when they call that psychiatrist. However, when the psychiatrist shows up, he doesn't believe them and he thinks it's just a delusion. And when they try to show him the bodies are no longer there, and in place of the bodies is just this weird fluff substance. And so the psychiatrist convinces at least some of them that it's not real. Like Miles, for example, is starting to be like, man, I think he's right. I think this is just a delusion. However, Theodora and Jack still don't want to go back to their own house because they're just so shaken up by this experience. And so they all end up staying at Miles's house for the next day or two. And in the evening, they find 4 giant pods in Miles's house that are creating human replicas of the four of them. And so they are freaked out and they make a run for it and they leave town. However, they stay at a hotel for one night, but then they're just kind of like, well, we don't have anywhere to go, so I guess we'll just go back home. And so they go back to their hometown. However, it is being overrun by these pod people. They're never referred to as pod people in the book or any of the movies, but nowadays when we talk about these films, we often call them the pod people because they grow from these pods. So yeah, the town is being overrun by these pod people who are replicas of their human counterparts. And turns out that the duplication process and the replacement process happens when the original is asleep. And so the pod people are trying to get Miles, Jack, Becky, and Theodore to fall asleep. That way they too can be replaced. And long story short, the four of them are separated. So we have Miles and Becky that are together, and they go to Miles's office to hide out. And while in there, they are confronted by a group of these pod people. And they're telling them, like, it's better to just be one of us. Just let it happen. Let yourself fall asleep. And you'll like it better when you're like us, because life is easier and better and more peaceful because we have no strong emotions. Like, there's no hate, but there's also no love. And so because there is no hate and no anger, it's just a very peaceful life. However, Becky and Miles don't want a life without emotion and without goals and ambition. And so ultimately, they are able to escape this building by pretending to be pod people, because if you just act emotionless, you can fool them and think you're one of them. And so they are able to escape, and they end up coming across the farm where the pods are being harvested, and they light the pods on fire in the book. And then the pods kind of just like disintegrate up into the atmosphere. And then from there, the pod people just decide to leave. And so then Miles and Becky go to Jack and Theodora's house where they had been staying, and they had managed to avoid being replaced. So it is the real Jack and Theodora. And so the four of them meet up, and all of the pod people have left. So now the town is just kind of empty. It's just this ghost town. But the story ends with it being implied that over time, more people will move in, and eventually this town will be back to its old self. And so the 1956 movie is very similar in many ways. However, we do not have the foursome leaving town for that one night. And there is also a scene in the book when Miles calls up a friend in the Pentagon, and he tells this guy the whole story, but the guy is kind of like, I mean, I trust you, but there's nothing I can do because no one will think this is real. And both of those scenes are not in the movie, which I think makes sense because both of these moments in the book almost felt kind of pointless. Like, I think the author was showing how the characters tried all of these different options. You know, they try leaving town, they try calling an authoritative person they know, but it's showing how they try these methods, but it's all to no avail essentially. But I still felt like they were kind of pointless, so I was fine with the movie getting rid of that. But also in the movie, Jack, and I guess Theodore, but Jack specifically, we see he is replaced by a pod person. When they confront him in Miles's office, Jack is one of the people that is there trying to convince him, like, yeah, this is better, we shouldn't have fought it, just come and join us. And then also at this moment in the book, so in both book and movie, they kind of pretend to agree to let themselves become pods. And so the people place these two pods in the office. And the reason he's able to convince them to be alone in the book is that he basically tells them, like, let us just have sex one more time, because once we're pod people, like, we won't be interested in sex because we won't have any emotions or feelings. So just let us alone so we can do this one last time. And they agree, and that's why they leave them alone. But in the book, he has these two skeletons, a male and female skeleton, and basically they are able to trick the pods into replicating the skeletons instead of themselves, which was an interesting scene, but this was not the case in the movie. But also in the book, they talk about these different newspaper articles of just like strange things that happen in different parts of the country, including one story where a farmer finds these strange pods on his farm, and there is this like biologist guy who they interview about these pods. And so they go to talk to this professor, and later when they are hiding in Miles's office, the professor is part of the group that comes to talk to them. And so it turns out when they originally did go see him, he had already been a pod person, and this professor character is not in the movie. And it seems like in the book they tried harder to explain things, kind of like with this professor. And so I like that in the movie they didn't try to explain it. Like, it just kind of is what it is, and I think I preferred that. But also in the movie, a change is that at one point Miles and Becky are on the run, and they're up in the hills, and they're very tired because they haven't slept in like I don't know, it's been over 24 hours for sure, but even longer than that, maybe closer to 48. And so they're in the hills and they're both feeling so tired, and Miles leaves to go scope things out further down, and so Becky stays up where they're at. And when he returns, he sees that Becky had fallen asleep and she had been replaced. And he realizes this when he kisses her, and she doesn't have that emotion anymore because they had been falling in love throughout the course of this story. And so this is when he realizes that she has been replaced. And I did love this change in the movie. However, if you think about it, it doesn't make sense because the movie with Becky, it's implying that the aliens took over her exact body. And then it's like, wait, but that's not what this whole movie is about though, because throughout the movie, we see that the pod people create a new duplicate. And so then it raises the question of like, one, what happens to the original bodies then when the duplicate is here? And with Becky specifically, it's kind of confusing because it's implying again that it took over her original body when that's not what the pod people do. They create a duplicate. And so while I like this change, it kind of didn't make sense when you think about it. But in the movie, after he realizes that Becky is one of them, he then is able to run out onto the highway, like getting out of Mill Valley where this book takes place. And so he is trying to chase down these cars and get them to stop, trying to tell them like they're taking over and you're next. And so he's freaking out, trying to warn these other people. And also he sees this semi truck and it is going to like Los Angeles and San Francisco and all these major cities, and it is full of the pods, showing that they are going to take over the world basically. And that is how Don Siegel wanted the movie to end. However, the studios thought that was a bit too bleak of an ending. And so then Don Siegel had to bookend the movie with an intro that has Miles being interrogated in a hospital, and then we get the bulk of the story, and then it ends with us back at the hospital. Miles is wrapping up his story, and initially the doctors are like, clearly he's crazy. But then they hear about a car crash that happened, and one of the semi-trucks involved in the car crash had a lot of these strange pods. And so they realize that Miles was telling the truth, and then the movie ends with them calling the FBI. And so it's interesting because the book does have a positive ending. And so it's interesting that Don Siegel didn't want a positive ending. However, the studios, of course, didn't want his bleak ending. And so ultimately, he kind of had to give it a positive ending regardless. And the movie has a voiceover throughout because again, this is framed as him telling the story to these doctors, and this voiceover was also added after the fact. And so I don't know if there's a cut of this movie that does not have those bookend scenes and it does not have the voiceover, but I'd be very curious to see what this movie was supposed to be like originally, because I do think the voiceover was unnecessary, and I do like the fact that originally it ended with him just freaking out on the highway. And then to talk about the 1978 movie, so here our main character is Matthew instead of Miles, and then the female character is Elizabeth instead of Becky, and the two of them are co-workers but also good friends. And we start with seeing Becky take a pod home. It is very small and she takes it home not realizing what it is, and then it takes over her boyfriend, and so her boyfriend is now one of these replicas, and she knows that something is off with him, and so she's confiding in Matthew, telling him about this, and he eventually tells her like, you need to see my psychiatrist friend. And so he takes her to see this psychiatrist. However, he convinces her that it's not real and it's just a delusion, and it's just her looking for an excuse to leave the relationship, basically being like, people these days just hop in and out of relationships and you're just trying to find a reason to end this relationship. But like in the book and movie, Matthew has a friend named Jack. In this version, Jack's wife name is Nancy, and Jack and Nancy find this strange body, not in their home, but in their place of business that they own. And so they find this strange body and they show it to Matthew, and then we have Matthew going to Becky's house where he sees a replica of, or Elizabeth's house, where he sees a replica of her growing, and so he saves the real Elizabeth. And then again, we see the body at Jack's business turning into Jack, which was so well done in this movie. Yeah, it was so good. And so then the four of them are freaking out and they go to Matthew's house. Matthew calls his psychiatrist yet again, and this guy convinces them that they're just delusional and that it's all fine. And so while they are at Matthew's house falling asleep, Nancy is awake and she ends up seeing that these pods are growing their replicas, and so she wakes them up. And again, this scene too was so good. Like the pods and the replicas look so creepy and the practical effects are just so good, but it was so suspenseful because because Donald Sutherland, who plays Matthew, he's sleeping right where the pods are growing next to him. It was such a suspenseful scene, and it was just so good. But from here, they go on the run. They're trying to escape San Francisco, which is being overtaken with pod people. And ultimately, Jack sacrifices himself for the others. And then they're separated from Nancy, and Matthew and Elizabeth are on the run kind of in the hills. And he leaves Elizabeth because he sees a ship, and he's like, we can escape on a ship. I'll go check it out. And so he goes to check out the ship, but the ship is being loaded with pods, and so they can't use that to escape, and it's showing that the pods are being taken throughout the country. And when he returns to Elizabeth, she is in the process, like the last stages of being turned into a pod person. And so he is holding her original body when it just disintegrates in his arms, and then her replica arises and tells him to join them. However, he runs away from her, and like in the book, he finds where they are like harvesting these pods, and he lights it on fire, tries to destroy it, and then we see him trying to hide from the pod people who are chasing him, and then we fade to white, and then we cut to him back at work, and all of these pod people clearly just have no emotion. And so we know in all versions we hear that you can fool the pod people by just not showing any emotion, and they will believe you are one of them. And so we see Matthew, and we don't know if he is just blending and pretending or if he is an actual pod person, until he then goes outside and we see Nancy, and she had survived this whole time, and she is just trying to blend in, and she sees Matthew, and she thinks he is doing the same as she is, so she calls out to him. When then in this version, the pod people have this shriek that they do, which is unique to this film, and when he sees her, he points and he does this shriek, alerting the others that there is a human about, and she just breaks down and is hysterical as she has this realization. And this was such a shocking ending, and the actress who plays Nancy, she didn't know that it was going to end this way. She thought that Donald Sutherland's character really was still Matthew, and so originally he was going to acknowledge her in some way. And so instead, when he points and shrieks and reveals he is a pod person, her reaction was genuine because she did not know that that is what was going to happen. And to talk about the process of the replicas being created from these pods, so in the book and the 78 movie, the original human turns into this fluff substance once their replica is finished. And so we see that in the 78 movie because we constantly see this garbage truck driving around, and people are dumping this gray fluff substance into this garbage truck. And it is because they are throwing away that substance that is left when the replica takes over. And again, that is from the book too. That is what remains of the humans. But then also, if a human wakes up amid the replicating process, then the unfinished replica is the one that disappears and turns into this fluff. And again, we see that in the 78 movie, but in the original movie, we don't see that. And so you're kind of left to wonder, like, what happened to the original bodies? Like, these replicas must have a ton of bodies laying around. Like, how are they getting rid of them? But it's because they never acknowledged the fact that the original bodies turn into this fluff. And again, it also makes it not make sense in the 56 movie when Becky is taken over. Again, at the end, you're just like, wait, what? Like, that's not adding up with how the story has been told to us. But again, the 78 movie fixes this by having Elizabeth like disintegrate in his arms. And that was just such a great scene. And again, the practical effects in the 78 movie are so good. I will say though, the pods, they do look really good in the 56 movie. And when they see them in Miles's house, like cracking open and creating the replicas, I was very impressed. And this movie had such a low budget. Like, they didn't have an effects budget, and yet they had to create these effects. And so I was very impressed. However, the 78 movie, it's just so good. It's so gross and weird and unsettling, but again, just so well done. I absolutely loved it. And I also loved in the credits sequence, we see this substance on its planet as it travels through space and eventually lands on Earth and starts growing on Earth. And so I thought that was a really cool intro of the movie. But also early on in the movie, when Elizabeth is finding the pod and taking it home, we then cut to a priest on a swing who is just staring at her, and it's very ominous and uncomfortable and weird. And we never return to this character again. And the priest is played by Robert Duvall. So you think he's gonna come back because, you know, it's Robert Duvall, but then nothing happens. It's just like a very unsettling start to the film. And so, yeah, even though I kept waiting for him to return at some point, he never does. But yeah, I really like that too at the start of the movie because you're just so unsettled right off the bat. And I also like how the 78 movie has a lot of nods to the original movie. For example, I mean, an obvious nod is the fact that the guy who plays Miles has a cameo in this movie. He runs up to the car that Matthew and Elizabeth are in, and he runs up to the car being like, "You're next, they're taking over." And he's like literally saying the same thing that he said at the end of the 56 movie, like this exact same dialogue. And so I just loved that part of the movie. But also in the 56 movie, they escape his office by being emotionless and acting like they're pod people. However, in the 56 movie, Becky, she sees a dog run into the street and it startles her because she thinks it'll be run over. And so then she like yells out because she is startled. And this version has that too, where they are trying to blend in with the pod people. However, Elizabeth yells out because she sees a dog, but she yells out because the dog has a human face with a dog body. And we had this homeless character who has a dog who plays his banjo, and we see him asleep with his dog next to a pod. And so it turns out the pod replicated a combination of him with his dog. And it was so bizarre and again, so unsettling and weird. And so I just loved how it was a nod to the original movie while putting its own twist on it. And then again, having Becky/Elizabeth be turned into a pod person, that is not from the book. That is something the 78 movie took from the 56 movie. Same with Jack. In the book, Jack stays human, but in the 78 movie and the 56 movie, he is turned into a pod person, and he is one of the people who confront Becky and Miles/Elizabeth and Matthew. And in all versions, the psychiatrist who told them they were delusional, we find out that he is also a pod person because, again, he is in this group who confronts them in this scene in Miles's office. In the book and in the 56 movie, we don't know exactly when he had turned into a pod person, but in the 78 movie, early on, when he's telling them that, you know, these bodies aren't here anymore, like clearly you're delusional, right after that, we see him get into a car with a bunch of other pod people. So we see that like this whole time, he's been a pod person, and I just thought that was a great reveal in the movie. But before I get to book versus movies, I want to talk about communism because the book and original movie are often said to be an allegory for communism and McCarthyism when Senator McCarthy was on the hunt for communists. And so just the nation was kind of freaking out in this paranoia how like anyone you know could secretly be a communist and we need to find them and we need to hunt them out. And also how, you know, the way the pod people are just so lacking in emotion and there's no ambition, there's no goals, it's just an emotionless world with no individuality, and how that was kind of the American fear of what communist Soviet rule would be like. And it's interesting because, yeah, the book and movie clearly have that subtext, and yet I read that the writer and Don Siegel claimed that that was not in their head when they made this book or movie. However, I feel like even if they're not consciously thinking that that is the subtext going on, obviously that was happening in the world and they were being influenced by the world, by what was happening. And so even if they weren't consciously thinking that that is what the symbolism was, I think that was still in their subconscious. And so they could have had that theme going on without even realizing it. And Don Siegel's son said that his dad had not been thinking of politics when he made this movie. He was just trying to make a horror movie. But then in another interview, Don Siegel himself said that he was aware of the political subtext. So I don't know if he was aware while filming or not. It's kind of unclear, but yeah, these days we definitely see it as symbolic of communism and McCarthyism. But when it comes to movie versus movie, I personally prefer the 78 film. I do love the 56 movie, and I think it really holds up, and I would definitely watch it again. But the 78 movie, again, the graphics are just so good, and the story and the movie is just so suspenseful and so thrilling, and I love the performances. And I love the chemistry between Brooke Adams and Donald Sutherland. And early on, they just have such a great screen presence and their chemistry is just so good. And there's a part early on when she is confiding in him that she's worried her boyfriend is an imposter. And as a way to lighten the mood, he's like, oh, do that thing with your eyes, because if you do that thing with your eyes, then, we know you're not crazy. And turns out Brooke Adams can do this weird thing where her eyes vibrate like crazy. And so that was a fun scene. And they were just so cute together early on. But yeah, the movie itself was just so exciting and so suspenseful. And so between the two movies, I prefer the 78 film. But the book, I really loved too. And even though it's this thriller horror novel, which can be very creepy and eerie at times, it also has such great commentary going on. And I'm not even talking about the communism aspect, but because there's a part where, this is 1954, and yet he is writing how frustrating and unrealistic it is when females are portrayed as just standing by as men do the fighting, and the females just do nothing and they're not helping. And so Becky points out how that's so unrealistic, and Becky is with Miles fighting side by side with him. And so that was a great part. But then also we hear this story about a shoe shiner, a black shoe shiner, who acts like he loves his job, but then Miles secretly overhears him at one point and realizes that he doesn't like his job. And just that whole story I thought was just a really great reflection of society at the time. And it was very sad, but I thought that was a really great part of the story. But then also Miles, he accuses the pod people because they tell him in the book that pod people only live for 5 years and then they die and they cannot procreate. So once the last of them dies, that's it. And so they're going to come to Earth, take over every human on the planet, and then once they die, the planet will just be barren and abandoned. And so Miles points out, like, you're just going to use up this planet and then leave it. And the pod people say, like, that's what humans do too. Like, you just use up the Earth, you know, get the resources you need, and then once it's barren, you abandon it. And so that too, I thought was really great commentary. And I also like the theme from the book, which we see in both movies, about how it's better to deal with the negative emotions alongside the positive than to just have no emotions at all, right? Like, it's better to experience love, even though along with love, you also end up feeling sadness and heartbreak and hate and anger. And then if you have ambition and goals, you also have to deal with failure, right? But how our main characters know that it's better to have those negative emotions alongside the positive than to just have no emotion whatsoever. And then also something that surprised me is that the book also does have not a lot of humor, but it has quite a few moments of humor throughout. And I thought it was really well balanced because the movie, the 56 movie, apparently originally did have more humor, but Don Siegel felt like it took away from the horror of the story. And I think that was a good call because there have been books and movies where the comedic elements take away from the suspense and the thrill of the story. And so I think that was a good call for the movie. However, I thought the book did a good job at balancing a few comedic moments in a story that was just very thrilling and engaging. And so I want to give credit where credit is due because these movies exist because of the book, and I do recommend the book. I really liked it. But when it comes to book versus movies, I already said I prefer the 78 film over the 56. And when it comes to the 78 film versus the book, I'm gonna have to say the movie wins. And I really loved this adaptation. I would happily watch it many times more. I would watch the 56 movie again too, but I thought this was a great adaptation. And again, while it has its differences and it's a modern take on the story, a lot of the plot beats, like I said, do follow the book. And then the ending is just so bleak and haunting and startling, but I think it was a great ending. Whereas the ending to the book caught me by surprise, but not in a good way. It just felt, I don't know, like I felt kind of disappointed by the book ending, honestly. But regardless, I would still recommend the book. I would recommend both movies, but ultimately the 78 is my favorite. And then also with this movie, I want to mention real quick that Jeff Goldblum, a young Jeff Goldblum, plays Jack. I thought he was great. And then Leonard Nimoy plays the psychiatrist, so that was pretty cool. And Brooke Adams, she plays Elizabeth, and I have talked about one of her other movies because she was in The Dead Zone, which I covered not too long ago, so I will link to that in case you want to watch more Brooke Adams related content. And thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe and share and all of that good stuff. And I will see you next time. Bye.